Hi, this is Susan Saarinen, daughter of Eros Saarinen, the architect.
Hi, I'm Celia Bertoia, daughter of Harry Bertoia.
Hi, I am Carla Hartman, granddaughter of Charles and Ray Eames, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. You may not know the name of architect Louis Kahn. He was not particularly well known by the public like Frank Lloyd Wright or Richard Neutra or even Craig Elwood. He didn't design any airports and only a few houses. He didn't have the celebrity we see today in architects like Santiago Calatrava and Bjarke Ingels. He never won the Pritzker Prize, the Oscar of Architecture. Yet this enigmatic genius, who died almost 50 years ago, is revered by the design profession around the world as the architect's architect. You'll want to Google the Phillips Exeter Library, the Salk Institute, and the Yale Center for British Art. Many of our guests today knew him well, including author Richard Saul Wurman, his former colleague Reyhan Larimer, landscape architect Harriet Pattison, with whom Kahn had a son, Nathaniel, and publisher Steve Kroeter. And now, if I can get him to pay attention, here's your host, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Sorry, I'm a little distracted. It's not a major news story, but I just learned that Rome, as in the city in Italy, has made some rather interesting cultural and design decisions about their Colosseum. You know, that big amphitheater, which has been around for a couple thousand years. It's one of the biggest tourist attractions in Italy, with tens of thousands visiting to experience stories of the glamour and glitz and gladiators of ancient Rome. If you're into violent sports, bloody sacrifices, and hideous killings. But hey, it was a different time. Now it's 2021, and this amazing ancient structure, a true engineering marvel, is going to become a real concert venue.
What?
Yep. They've decided to put in a new floor in this World Heritage Site. Concessions, more restrooms. Yes, you're hearing that right.
Because when you look down inside, you see all the labyrinth stuff below.
There's going to be a floor there now, evidently. And I'm sure that Pirelli or Ferrari or perhaps Sbarro is negotiating right now for the naming rights. Of course, my nomination for the first performer has to be Yanni. He's been rocking the ruins around the world for years. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Wendy Robineau and Don Beskind, and by Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In a timeless adventure that we are completely making up, realtor Angela Roll grew up in Estonia, the daughter of a former ambassador wrongly accused of spying on next-door Lithuania. He was cleared, it turns out, because Estonia only has 6 spies, and everybody pretty much knows who they are. After a night of partying with Le Corbusier's cousin Boozy Corbusier, Angela took the ferry across the Gulf to Finland, causing an international incident involving a little red dress, a wood-turning lathe, the Finnish Coast Guard, and a $2,400 bar tab she accidentally signed over to Bjork,
Iceland.
Angela escaped the resulting media frenzy on a train to Denmark in the company of international man of mystery Eric of Aarhus, whom she later married and even later moved to North Carolina to become a real estate agent. Specializing in modernist houses, Angela advises buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to shipping a wood-turning lathe from Helsinki. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Architect Louis Kahn trained in what's frequently described as the rigorous Beaux-Arts tradition. You know, the kind our friend the classicists love. I've never been clear on what was rigorous about it. Maybe they made the students do push-ups at every class. Today it would be kettlebells, but I digress. Famous for meticulous buildings, provocative unbuilt ideas, and his teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, Louis Kahn was one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. Kahn became a fellow in the AIA and won the AIA Gold Medal, the highest award they give, and later the Royal Institute of British Architects Gold Medal, the highest award they give. Our first guest is Steve Kroeter, the publisher of a soon-to-be reissued 1962 book, The Notebooks and Drawings of Louis Kahn by Richard Saul Wurman, who will join us later in the show. Coinciding with the 120th anniversary of Louis Kahn's birth, this 11 by 15 exquisite volume with 76 Kahn drawings is in development now for a later 2021 publication. Steve, a lot of people don't know of Louis Kahn. He wasn't one of the architects that was in the general public's eye when he was around, although he was known by many essentially as the architect's architect. Tell us about him.
Kahn was an extremely interesting person, perhaps most importantly from the perspective of just how seriously he took his art. I mean, he really wanted to understand what the building that he was working on, in his words, what it wanted to be. So I think he's kind of known for combining the what might be looked at as the monumentalism and the monolithical aspects of ancient architecture, along with the kind of core tenets of modernism, the lack of ornament and the focus on geometry. So he's known for kind of bringing those tendencies together, which was a very interesting thing. And once he became aware of that, he really kind of found himself, so to speak. And then the American Institute of Architects publishes lists of buildings that 25 years after their dedication have been deemed to be very important. And Kahn is unusual because he has 5 buildings on that list. They are the Yale Art Gallery, which was maybe his first significant commission, the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, the library that he did for Phillips Exeter Prep School, the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, and lastly, the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven. So those are probably the 5 buildings that he is best known for.
What happened to Kahn? How did he die?
Well, it's a very interesting and unfortunately a very sad story. He was on his way back from visiting with a client in India, flew through London, was supposed to be on a plane that would take him to Philadelphia, but got diverted to New York. And so after he landed at the airport in New York, he went to the train station in New York and was going to take a train. And while in the men's room at Penn Station in New York, he died of a heart attack. So very unusual, very tragic. And in fact, I've got here the opening paragraph from Paul Goldberger's obituary on the front page of the New York Times. And he said, Louis Kahn, whose strong forms of brick and concrete influenced a generation of architects and made him, in the opinion of most architectural scholars, America's foremost living architect, died Sunday evening, apparently of a heart attack, in Penn Station.
Wow, and Penn Station's gone now.
It's gone now, although its replacement just opened, I think, on New Year's Day. So a new project conceived by Daniel Patrick Moynihan took years in the making, but apparently it's now open. And circling back to the New York Times, Michael Kimmelman said that it was really well done.
Now, tell us about the book that you are working to reissue, one of the first books that was written about Kahn in the 60s.
That's exactly right. And the idea was Richard Saul Wurman's, and he told me that he was a student at Penn while Kahn was on the faculty there. And he says he remembers very clearly sitting in on his first class with Kahn, and Richard was living at home at the time with his parents. And he says he went home and he told his parents, I just met somebody who's going to be very famous. So from the very first moment that Wurman met Kahn, he knew there was something special there. And eventually he decided to do a book on Kahn because there was really very little information in print on Kahn at that time. So Wurman told Kahn, or asked him or told him, that he wanted Kahn involved, but Wurman really wanted to pick which texts and which drawings were featured in the book. And that was a very brave thing because Wurman, I think, was like 25 at the time.
Right. He was
Kahn
an adjunct professor, visiting professor at NC State.
I think that's right. Exactly. So he got the idea for this book, and he and Eugene Feldman, who was a very well-known and innovative printer at the time in Philadelphia, they put the book together. And it's called The Notebooks and Drawings of Louis Kahn. It's oversized, 11 by 15, and very elegantly done in linen covers and a lot of Kahn drawings, gatefolds in it. It's the kind of book that not only are the ideas and the content very beautiful, but it just strikes your senses when you see it and feel it. It's a really beautifully executed book.
And this was a very limited edition when it came out, correct?
There were 2 editions that were done. The first one was done by Falcon Press, which actually was run by Feldman, and that had 1,800 copies, which sold out relatively quickly. And then about 10 years later, MIT Press picked it up, and they did about 3,000 copies in their edition.
Now, how can people get this book when it comes out again?
We're going to do a funding campaign on Kickstarter. And the Kickstarter will have launched on February 17th, and it's going to run through the end of March. So we're very excited about that, and we hope that there's an audience that is very interested in seeing this book available again.
So all they have to do is go to Kickstarter and search for Louis Kahn, and they should find it?
Right, yeah, and I think there might be 1 or 2 other Kahns there, but there's only one Louis Kahn on Kickstarter. That's one way to find it. The other way is that we have an official website that has a lot of information about Kahn's career in general, and this book in particular, and that website address will have a direct link to the Kickstarter, and it's a very easy website address to remember. It's louisikahn.com.
Louisikahn.com.
Exactly.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. This is a great overview.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Philadelphia native Richard Saul Wurman is the Isaac Asimov of design, a prolific architect and graphic designer who has written, designed, and published 90 books on wildly divergent topics. A student and former employee of Louis Kahn, 2 of Richard Saul Wurman's books include The Notebooks we mentioned earlier, plus What Will Be Has Always Been, a collection of Kahn's ideas and quotes. Richard is a young man with a lot of promise.
Yes.
Because at a mere 85 years of age, he's gotten honorary doctorates, Graham Fellowships, a Guggenheim, NEA grants, and a distinguished professorship at Northeastern University. Wurman created and chaired the legendary TED Conference in 1984, which has spawned TED Talks all over the world. A lot of them are on YouTube. His latest book is Understanding Understanding, a wild journey through the nature of knowing, and in development, a book called Mortality. Welcome, Richard.
Nice to be here. Can I correct some facts, though?
Please.
First of all, I've never been introduced as an author, but that's perfectly okay. And the interesting thing about the notebooks and drawings of Louis Kahn was that I did it actually the year that I first met our other guest today, and I was 25 years old when I did it, and it was the first book ever done on Lou Kahn. And it's interesting for that, too, that it was so early, and before he said yes to anybody else, he said yes to a lowly little kid. And that comes back to visit me a long time of questioning, why did he do that? That's about all. Oh, yes, and you mentioned Estonia in some of your remarks, and that's where Lou was born.
Oh, yes.
And
he wasn't one of the 6 spies, was he?
No,
Okay.
but he was born in a little teeny island off of another teeny island off of Estonia. He was born in a spot of an island off of Ocel, and he was born 120 years ago.
Wow.
And that's fascinating.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about our other guest, too, architect Reyhan Larimer. She was born in Turkey, and by the age of 11, she decided to be an architect. She attended the American College for Girls in Istanbul, then graduated with a BA in math from Sweetbriar College in Virginia. North Carolina's famous modernist dean Henry Campheffner offered her a place in the North Carolina State School of Design back in the 60s, one of the few women ever admitted. She's published works of Harwell Hamilton Harris, plus 4 books on Kahn, Corbusier, Paolo Soleri, and Alvar Aalto. After graduation, she worked for Louis Kahn from 1966 to 74. Then after Kahn died, she held positions with Venturi Scott Brown, the University of Pennsylvania, overseeing campus restoration work, and she's been at Yale since 2000, although she just retired in 2020. Welcome, Reyhan.
Thank you. It's great to be on, and it's wonderful to be talking to my teacher, Richard Wurman, so I'm very delighted.
Now, Reyhan, how and where did you and Richard first meet?
We met at North Carolina State when I was recruited by Henry Campheffner, who came actually to Sweetbriar looking for candidates. He especially wanted to further women in architecture, and he wanted to be able to see if there was anybody interested. And of course, I was already a senior and ready to go to architecture school. So I jumped at the chance. So I immediately, after graduating from Sweetbriar, went down to North Carolina and started the program.
And Richard, you taught at NC State for what, 2 years?
That's correct.
And how did you meet Louis Kahn? Was that before NC State or afterwards?
Oh, yes. I met Lou Kahn in 1954.
Okay.
When I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was teaching studios then, and I was precocious and an overachiever, and I used to go up to the upper class floors to see Lou, and from the very beginning, actually not a made-up story of recreated history, I was astonished by this strange man, highly scarred, had no presence and a squeaky voice, who was the first person I had met ever in my life who told the truth, always, in his observations. And it changed my life forever. Then I had him as an undergraduate in his studio. Then I had him for my master's degree. And then I worked for him. And then I did 2 books on him. One of them was the very first book, as we've said, that was ever done on him, that became sort of a cult little book, followed by some wonderful books on Kahn now. There's a terrific library now on Lou's work. Mm-hmm. You talked about his AIA medal and him never getting a Pritzker. Well, he didn't get the Pritzker because it wasn't given while he still was alive.
Right.
Had he been alive, he would have gotten the Pritzker. He did get the gold medal, as you said, from AIA in America, and the RIBA gold medal, which he got in 1972. He flew back to New York, flew to Colorado, flew in a teeny little propeller plane to Aspen, Colorado. I met him at the plane. He got off, and he said, "Ricky," which is what he called me, "let me show you something." He opened the box because he had just come from London and showed me. He was so proud. He showed me the gold medal, and he said, like a child, and that was part of his qualities. He said, "Look at this." And that was the year I was chairman of the ID International Design Conference in Aspen and had invited him there to speak.
Reyhan, how did you come to meet Louis Kahn?
Well, Richard was my first teacher at North Carolina State when he came.
And I was a baby.
In the fall of, pardon?
I was a baby.
Oh, yeah. So I had the pleasure of being his first student, first class that he taught at North Carolina State, and that's the way. And he invited Lou to come down for a charrette or a 2 or 3 day project. And so when he came, I met Lou Kahn, obviously. I had originally seen his Yale Art Gallery before I even went to North Carolina. So I was familiar with the one and the Richard building, and I was familiar with that much work of him, and of course everything that Richard told us and talked about Lou quite a bit. So that's the way I got to meet him. And then a year later, I went up to Philadelphia, and I walked into Lou's office and asked him if I could be an intern for the summer because I was between 2 years of architecture school. And he said, sure. So that was a wonderful thing. So Richard is really responsible for opening up the whole Lou Kahn period of my life, which was the best one ever. It was absolutely, I'm so grateful to him for that.
And then that was what, 1966, roughly?
My graduation was 66, but when he first came, it's 62.
Okay. And then you worked for Kahn until he passed away.
Correct. So I was an intern for one summer in 64, and then I came back the minute I graduated from North Carolina State. The next day I was on the train to Philadelphia, and I went to work on 66. That was June 66.
Okay.
And
okay.
I was there till the end, except for 2 years when I had to be away because I had my daughter.
Okay.
Reyhan, I think you know, but maybe you don't know, but I did write a note to Lou saying she is my best student.
You did. I'm sure you did. I know. I didn't know that, but from the reception I got, I assumed that that's what happened. No, but he was absolutely wonderful.
He was just a little bit different.
He was. That's true.
This is a question I'm going to ask both of you, but what was different about Lou Kahn? What was his way of speaking and speaking the truth that really got to you? Richard, why don't you start?
Well, I'm not a fan of poetry, so I'm using this word metaphorically. But he spoke about if a fly came and sat on your table, he would say something poetic about its flight and how he took off. There was something that he saw through a screen of thoughtfulness, of the essence of what, and this is sort of his words, of what that fly wanted to be. He spoke of animate and inanimate objects, he's famous for saying, in the same way. He spoke with the brick and asked the brick what it wanted to be. He was just a little different than the rest of us, and enough that he had this kind of ultimate care about how two materials met, kissed each other, said hello, and became an artistic moment. And it's hard to explain. He didn't teach a style. Those students who followed him and those other architects who adore him adored philosophically how he went about things. And there are few buildings in his style. People didn't copy his style because he was not a fashionista. He was an artist in the fundamental sense.
Reyhan, how about you? How did Kahn appeal to you?
He had such an amazing perception about everything. He read even people. He knew what you were about and everything else in life. He was, at the same time, he wasn't aloof or, let's say, reserved as such. He could be very worldly. He had a great sense of humor. And it was this mix of poetry with worldliness and universality that was so different and so amazingly wonderful about him. You could talk about the very normal things of during the day, but at the same time, he could perceive something in that which was very, very different than anyone else. He was just a very wonderful experience to be with him. He always had his little book that he wrote in and put sketches in. So his thoughts were always put down into his books. And at the same time, if he didn't tell it to someone, but he was always conscious of his surroundings and put down all of these ideas that came to him in his book and to other people. The thing that was so interesting is that he always worked one-to-one with people in the office. That is to say, it wasn't like, he was the boss or anything of that sort. He just came to you sat at your desk and sketched something that he saw in whatever I had been drawing or whoever has been drawing. And he furthered that by giving an idea and thinking about that particular thing that he saw. So it was always a developmental, non-ending design process. It was just always developing. He never wanted to see the end of a design process. He thought that even a finished building, he wanted to always make it even better. And this thought process never stopped. It was really very, very amazing. I just don't think I've never seen anyone else like that.
Reyhan, I don't know if you know this, but Lou said he never said anything new except to one person. If there was two people, he was making a presentation. And the only time he thought of something new was in a conversation with another person. And in the office, that's when you said he worked one-on-one. He worked one-on-one because he knew it could get to something that had clarity about it that he couldn't if there was two people there.
Correct. Correct. That's true. And there was never presentations. People weren't ever around tables while he was talking. It was always one-to-one. But at the same time, we all helped with each other. So it wasn't like your project only, where other offices you would be sitting there doing your own thing, trying to, develop something. You were always aware of other projects because you always helped to and were involved in other projects.
Reyhan, I don't know if you knew, but I used to go to football games with him fairly regularly and baseball games, and I couldn't tell anybody in the office because of the jealousies in the office. People wanted a piece of Lou.
Oh, man.
And we really didn't like it when he went off to travel. He was this substitute faux father of all of us, and we wanted a piece of him around.
Yeah, because when he wasn't there, nothing got developed,
Nothing happened.
Nothing wouldn't get going. And I always remember the 1 o'clock on, I think it was Fridays, when he had to go to class and hurry before he left. And then he would put his black cape on and walk downstairs and get a cab to go to Penn.
And he had a special letter from the cab company that allowed him to sit in the front seat. He never got a driver's license. And he liked to sit in the front. He liked to sit in the front seat of the cab, and he could present that, and all the cabbies knew him.
There seems to be a great story behind Kahn's projects. Richard, tell us about the famous Kahn barge. You were sent to London for a week to work on it, and you ended up staying 6 months.
The barge story is minor in many ways. I started work for him on a Friday. I remember this directly, and he sent me very young. I was 22 or 23 to London with some blueprints of some charcoal paper sketches, and he told me that I was to see these people there. When I got there, it was a great mix-up. Lou wanted just the project to go on, and he didn't want to bother with it so much. And they were expecting me to bring working drawings of this barge to go up the Thames. And I had charcoal paper drawings. And I either had to come home right then or do the project. In retrospect, now at 85, I look back on that. I look back on teaching in North Carolina. I look back on a half a dozen experiences in my life that actually were planned for me by Lou and a professor at Penn called Sasha Nowicki.
Oh, yeah, I know Sasha Nowicki, right, yeah.
Well, she and Lou and a little bit Bob Geddes had independently or collectively, I don't know which, I think Sasha and Lou planned it together, planned my life. I worked for Lou for a couple of years, and he said, you should go down and teach. It will be good for you. I think he sent me to London to see if I would survive. I think he was training me to be independent. I don't know if you remember this, Reyhan, but for quite a number of years, for a few years, he put my book of plans of 20 cities, those dot drawings, on the back wall of the office. And he hung the whole book there. I know it appears in Nathaniel's film about him. And and that was to give me permission to do work in other fields. And that was a pure cartographic and statistical job. And he gave me permission to be whatever I wanted to be. And I am grateful that he molded my life and gave me permission. So he really changed my life. The boat was just a boat. I stayed there. I stuck it out. I survived. It was launched. Lou and I argued on the phone. He never came over for it. I came home, and I was so angry that I was away for 6 months and sort of felt I wasn't treated right. I walked into his office to get the last $10 that they owed me. And as walking out, Lou came in and said, "What are you working on now, Ricky?" Never said even hello. "What are you working on now?" And he hadn't seen me in 6 months. And he put me down, and I sat to work on the Fisher House.
Oh, wow. Wow.
All my plans of never working for him again disappeared with his strange
Of course,
charm.
you didn't have any choice, right?
When did you realize that he was directing your life in a way?
Only recently. Somebody's writing my biography, and as I start telling stories, I connected the dots.
Now, tell our listeners, Richard, about the barge, because it really is one of the most unique vessels created.
Well, there was two barges. There was the smaller barge I did in London and in Surrey and in Dartford. In retrospect, it was a great experience for me and a horrible time. But it was a great experience of survival, doing something I didn't know how to do at all. And it gave me faith that maybe my speciality was my ignorance and not my expertise. And that every project basically I did after that, whether it was books or conferences, came from my desire to learn about something, not knowing about it. It came from not knowing, which was counterintuitive and still is for most people. So I have terror and confidence, and I only choose projects that I have no ability to do or no knowledge of. I'm not proselytizing that. I don't want anybody else to be that way. I'm just telling you about myself. Lou gave me that confidence by throwing me into the pit.
But let's get back to the barge, because I'm asking...
Oh, back to the barge. Then there was a second barge that was built, which is more elaborate, better designed, and which they're reviving.
I'm going to have to do this myself, evidently. So let me tell you all about this barge. So this barge is really a floating performance space.
Oh,
that's right.
It was
because I keep thinking garbage scow.
No.
Okay.
This was a venue where on the barge an orchestra could be, and it could pull up on the side of a dock area, and people could gather. And the top of the barge would kind of come up like on a hinge, and it would form an amphitheater shell that they could then perform out to the world. And this barge traveled the world for many, many years. And, of course, you know, you do that and things break, and it has been in mothballs for quite a while now, right, Richard?
Well, the first one, I think, it never moored on shore, had to have its own batteries. And you had to come out to the barge, the musicians, in a boat and get on the barge. It was away from the shore, but it had its own lighting, and it gave concerts at night. And it went from Battersea Park in London up to Oxford, Christchurch Meadows in Oxford, up the Thames. You're making me talk more about a small project than I want to, but I had to measure all the bridges and all the locks, because that information, for some reason, there was no information about how high the bridges up the Thames were, and these had the sides that lifted up to form a big stage, and we built it within inches of scraping some little bridges far up the Thames, and I had to hire the tugboat to tug it. I had to do all kinds of things that I didn't know how to do, and it has not pleasant memories, but very good for the growth of my independence. But it was not a masterpiece. It was interesting. It served its purpose, and it's not going to be first on my gravestone.
Okay. Now, as enigmatic as Kahn was, he was a muse for many people and still is today. However, even Kahn has a muse. There was an interesting character named Gabor Szalontai. What was he all about?
Well, maybe Reyhan and I have different opinions. I'll let Reyhan go first.
Well, Gabor was at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm not quite sure I ever knew what he did do, but anyway, he came to Lou's office, and he had great conversations with Lou. He pretty much tried to imitate Lou in the sense that he had a little notebook himself, and he would sit at a desk and write in it. And I understand that they had really great, dialogues. But Gabor never did any work as such. So it was a little bit difficult in the sense that he was occupying a desk in the studio when everybody else was running around trying to...
Oh, Reyhan, why don't you just say it? Why don't you say it? Bullshit baffles brains. That's a quote from Ian McHarg.
Okay. Like a groupie?
No, well, he was a good listener, and he had the intelligence.
He was a philosopher. He was. I would have to give him credit by saying
not. I never heard anything he said that was philosophy. I think he listened and hummed and said some words, and anything you said to Lou could. I told you. I think it goes back to the fly sitting on the table. Lou would make of that a profound thing, and whatever Gabor said, he would turn into a dialogue, but it was one-sided.
Yeah, but he pretended to be working at the office, which was the part that I'm very resentful for. Let's put it that way.
Emphasis on pretended.
Yeah, well, you can pull anybody listening, including yourself, Mr. Smart, you can listen to what we both said and draw your own conclusion.
Well, Reyhan, you got so frustrated one time you threw a shoe at him, right?
Well, because, he would be there at 3 in the morning when we were all up all night trying to get a presentation together. Let's say Lou would be going to Dhaka the next day, and you would be trying very hard to get all this stuff together. And all Gabor would be doing there is sitting, staring into the air, and then maybe writing a few things in his book. And it was such a useless situation that one night at the very, very, very late night, I lost my cool completely. And I don't know how I even thought of throwing a shoe, because I'd never done that in my life before or had seen anybody else do it. But sort of instinctively, I took my high-heeled shoe and just hurled it at him because I was so frustrated by this no-use person in a time of stress or crisis, let's say.
Did he throw it back?
Intense. No, it just hit the water cooler instead.
No. Anyway, he was passive in that way.
Okay.
Well,
he was trying to be a Buddhist monk.
Yeah, the problem is he just recently passed away, so I don't want to be talking badly about someone who's not with us anymore.
I would say the same thing if he was alive and could hear me.
Well,
okay. I'm glad you seconded me.
Now, Reyhan,
I'm not the only one. I'm only going on the record because of the fact that I threw a shoe anyway. Oh, gosh.
Reyhan, were you working on the FDR Memorial at all when Lou Kahn died?
Yeah. David Wisdom, Henry Wilcox, myself, and a couple of, I believe there were 7 of us that continued with the work after he died, and we worked on FDR Memorial, right.
Now, tell our listeners about the memorial and where it is and ultimately when it got finished.
Well, it was the very tip of Roosevelt Island in New York, where there was an old smallpox hospital in ruins from the 19th century. And this is a piece of land that protrudes looking south, and it's parallel to the United Nations. You could look across. It's an absolutely fabulous site. And
it's a very long, thin triangle with its point facing so the river goes around it as islands get that shape.
Right. And some of it had to be filled a little bit with riffraff because otherwise it wouldn't have been, able to support this memorial. But it was meant to be for FDR. Lou didn't really want to do a monument as such. He just created a room at the end of the triangle. And
with no roof, the walls.
Without a ceiling, open. Let's say a courtyard. But it's at the end of a very long walk, which you come up to the site, which you go up this big set of stairs, and then the site slopes slowly toward the end where the room is located. And FDR's bust, or the portrait itself, the sculpture itself, is actually facing not into the room, but onto the walk as you come down, as a focal point of the walk. It's a tree-lined walk, which Harriet had something to do with, quite a bit to do with, actually. And the room itself has FDR sayings carved into the wall. And it's granite blocks that are put together with very small openings between so that they're separate pieces. And the very end is open to the sea, so to say, so that the southern end is completely open. And the very end has what we call a ha-ha that Lou really got from English landscape architecture mostly, which is really one that doesn't have any railing at all. That is, you step down and then you are level with the water almost, but there's really no railings on it. And this has caused quite a bit of stir recently because the city of New York keeps wanting to put railings on the thing, saying that it's not safe for the people. And I think they've cordoned it off right now and won't let people get down it.
Tell them to take a trip to Venice and think of what railings would be by every canal.
Exactly, or Amsterdam for that matter.
Or Amsterdam, any place. I mean, it's silly.
Yeah. But what happened is that while we were working on it, we had to get somebody in New York to be able to do the working drawings. That is to say, manage the actual project. And we went with Mitchell and Jurgela's office. And right at that point, UDC, who was the sponsor of the memorial, went bankrupt. So the whole project was put on hold completely. And it's been dormant for years till about 10 years ago.
2012, it opened up.
And that's when the whole thing was rejuvenated, so to say.
Long, long after Lou died.
Yes, about 38 years.
Yes, exactly.
We have a whole show on the Four Freedoms Park with Paul Brokus of Mitchell Jurgela. It's episode 81, and you can listen to Paul and I walk around the whole complex there.
Good. So you don't have to have my description of it as such, but that's the way it was conceived anyway at the time, yep. And it's pretty much worked out the same way with some minor modification.
Richard, I want to wrap up here talking about the reissue of your book. This is, even by wonderful coffee table standards, this is a gorgeous book that you are getting ready to reissue. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just very elaborate, almost breathtakingly beautiful.
Well, I look back and I still have a fondness for it, and it was done when you do things later in your life. Even the website that was done for this project, I think it's done within your mind. You say, what would Lou think? Would he like it? And I know he liked this book. Nathaniel said it was his favorite book, Nathaniel Kahn, which touched me. I didn't know that. And I know it was the last thing he bought before he died. He bought 2 copies of it and took with him to India. He loved to give it away. Aldo Jurgela of Mitchell Jurgela did a beautiful book on Lou. There's many beautiful books with beautiful photographs of his buildings and final models and things. This book has none of that. It's not a sexy book in that way, but it is a thoughtful book because it looks at his process and his thinking, and there's pictures of his yellow paper drawings, which architects call yellow trash. It's tracing paper that he drew with charcoal, and I had the finest of printers as my partner on it by the name of Gene Feldman. When I went to Lou at the age of 25, wet behind my ears, several people had asked him, could they do a book on him? And he had said, no, 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 no. I had never done a book before. And I went and I asked him, Lou, can I do a book on you? And he just said yes. Shocked me. I don't know why he said yes. He said yes. And I said, I just want some of your sketches and your words. That's all I want. I don't want anything finished. I just want your process because I want to have that book. And I went back to pick out the drawings. He said, well, I'll choose these drawings. I said, no, Lou, you're missing the point. I would like to choose the drawings. And he smiled, and he had a crinkly smile because his face was so scarred. And I said, no, the whole idea is that I pick the drawings that I think would be interesting, and sometimes there'll be a couple drawings of the same thing to show your process, but not finished drawings, no photographs. And he said, okay, Ricky, I'll be very interested to see what you choose. We came out with a few copies, and then we did a second printing. And for the second printing, he wrote an introduction by hand. I have it on my wall here, his handwritten introduction, in which he said he was very interested in what Ricky chose, very interested in it. They wouldn't have been what he would have chosen, but he was fascinated that I chose some versions of the same thing with my mistakes in them to show the process. So he got it. And he knew it was not a perfect book or perfect drawings or trying to give him publicity, but really people who worked with him understood the process. And that was a great time in my life. I hope you agree. Reyhan, by the way, I will tell you because it's being recorded, was my best student in North Carolina for the 2 years I was there.
Thank you. Thank you.
She was a good student, and it was filled with Lou Kahn, and I hope it gave you a good start in life.
Oh, it did. The best period of my life. There was no question. You had to give yourself to the work, and it was really very, very intense, day and night, but it's just wonderful. I cherish that time.
If you'd like to be part of this book and bringing it back, there's a Kickstarter campaign going on right now. You can sign up to help support the reissue of the book and sign up for an early release of the book. Just go to Kickstarter and type in Louis Kahn, K-A-H-N, and you can get on board with the program. Reyhan, Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
Thank you. It was great.
Harriet Pattison graduated from the University of Chicago. While studying at Yale with people like Joseph Albers, she met Lou Kahn in 1953. But the real sparks flew years later in Philadelphia, where she and Kahn had a romantic relationship, and later a son, Nathaniel. Harriet is an accomplished landscape architect, working in the Vermont office of the famous Dan Kiley and studying landscape architecture under Ian McHarg at the University of Pennsylvania School of Fine Arts. Harriet worked for George Patton, and she opened her own office designing everything from intimate gardens to large-scale commissions, including the master plan for Hershey's Pennsylvania headquarters. Harriet collaborated with Lou Kahn on a number of projects, especially fulfilling, after his death in 1974, the 2012 completion of the FDR Memorial in New York City. In 2016, she was inducted as a fellow at the American Society of Landscape Architects. Our Days Are Like Full Years, a memoir with letters from Louis Kahn, was released last year. Welcome, Harriet.
Hello, George. Thank you for that introduction.
So before we get started, I have to ask, are there chocolate fountains at the Hershey headquarters? I think that would be the perfect landscape feature.
No. No, I never thought of that.
You could always go back and suggest that they had them.
Absolutely.
Now, you met Lou Kahn briefly in 1953, but it wasn't until several years later that you were introduced through architect Robert Venturi.
Yes.
When did you know that you were in love?
Immediately. And that it would be a lifetime love.
Wow. That's just like in the movies.
Absolutely in the movies.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, let me read my prologue.
All right.
There is a Chinese cinnabar box on a bookshelf by my bed. It is filled with letters from the architect Lou Kahn, who died in 1974. Lou, as he was called by nearly everyone, was my teacher, my inspiration, my companion, and the love of my life. Yet he was 27 years older and had been married for nearly as many years when we met. It was my hope that someday we would live together, but that was not to be. And we were perhaps apart more than we were together in the 15 years between our meeting and his death. This is a small portion of time in most lives, and yet measureless in intensity and effect in ours. Because of our separations, his travels, and our feelings, Lou wrote to me often, and I kept his letters in my treasure box. Once read, they rested there undisturbed. Like much of my life, they were unexamined, put off for a later time. But it is a later time now, for I am past 90. One day, suddenly curious as the cat that sat beside me, I lifted the lid of the box, and the letters spilled out as if they'd been waiting with their contents eager to be read. And there was Lou, thinking, dreaming, traveling, drinking in the world with boundless enthusiasm and wonder. I found him in every phrase. He was by turn confiding, poetic, funny, and wise. And I remembered the anticipation of opening each of his letters. I found myself inside them, too, young again, in love, and challenged to raise our child on my own and venture on a career. They brought back events I had shared in, events in his most productive years, when opportunities came from across the world to create masterworks for a great variety of people and their institutions. In them, Lou's voice, unmistakable and haunting, lives again, calling for my accompanying narrative and reflections on being liberated from the dark forgetting of the Cinnabar box.
Wow.
That is beautiful.
Yeah. I'm just like, holy cow. Okay. Well, the book, which I've read about half of all the way through, I find myself stopping to kind of emotionally rest because it's so powerful to read his letters to you. Is there one that he wrote to you from Paris you might share with us?
Oh, yes, sure. The one in 1968 on his way between Rome and Venice. Dearest, we don't feel the Paris uprising too much in America, but here everything is affected. Tourists everywhere have to reroute their flight around Paris because the services at the airport in Paris are dead. De Gaulle is in a tight spot. Money changers, the scum of the earth, are putting their gambling instincts on the German mark, dividing dollars, pounds, and francs. I hope they go completely broke and die of heartbreak. I hate the work that sells money. Money must be earned to have meaning. I always think of how can I change the world, never realizing that the world is inaccessible except through a single person. Love, Lou.
How many of these letters were in that Cinnabar box?
Oh, well over 100, and many postcards as well.
And from all over the world, right?
From all over the world.
Did you travel with him?
No. But I traveled with his thoughts.
Right.
And I might read another letter, which is very different.
This is about one of his most famous projects.
Yes. The book itself is a kind of autobiography of 15 years in Lou's life. And it's kind of a unique perspective. And it's certainly the best record we have of, since he didn't write books, of his thoughts and his work. But here is a letter from 1963, written from Dhaka in what is now Bangladesh, but was then East Pakistan, on his first really great assignment abroad. And he visits the site. This is his first visit. The site is a no-man's land, completely without distinction. Not a contour, a cluster of trees, not a distant landmark. I was driven around in a jeep, crisscrossing the site, and all the time thinking of what can make it worthy of the thoughts I had before I saw it. Then at lunch, it dawned on me to include in the assembly group a mosque. This somehow twisted me from the hopelessness of the location. I was sure then that I could design something that could be its own force, and even if an inspiring location would have other spaces suggest themselves, it would not have been as valuable if I had not thought of the mosque. When I presented that afternoon the idea of an axial relation of the assembly complex and a mosque, it was as though heaven descended on the authorities. They thought it was it. I am stunned by the completeness of their approval, because they said, "You have put religion in this capital just what it needed to give the meaning it lacked," unquote. I saw the relation of meeting of people to legislate as in itself of religion and strengthened it with the presence of the mosque. They saw it the same way. Love, Lou. P.S. I so hope that your new environment is good to you. Try hard to get acquainted with it. And that was in Vermont when I worked as an apprentice.
I'm thinking about the difference between Dhaka and Vermont. It's two very different environments.
Totally different environments.
Was he building a parliament building or some sort of...
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
He was building a parliament, the legislative capital for a divided Pakistan, east and west.
Right.
And this was for East Pakistan, which ultimately became Bangladesh.
Now, Harriet, you were the landscape architect in Lou Kahn's office for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial on Roosevelt Island in New York City. Tell me about that.
Yes, I can tell you about that. That was probably the most exciting project that I had with Lou. I was brought in from the beginning, and it was a fascinating site, very unusual for New York, because it was in the middle of the East River. It was really a dump site at the edge of Welfare Island, which became Roosevelt Island. But originally it had been a site for poor and convicts and people who had smallpox and diseases. But then it was restored and has been restored into a residential complex, and with this memorial, which is a great open space at the end of the island, built on the dump that was delivered from excavations for the tunnels under the river. But my role started when Lou brought it to my room in his office and laid out the plans. It was 4 acres, approximately. And my first act was to try and dramatize this site from a distance, seen across the river by people in Manhattan and in Queens. And that was to change the topography and to raise the triangle. It was a triangle with an edge where Lou was going to place his monument, but to raise it at one end high enough to create a profile to which were added trees and promenade walks on either side, emerging at the end to the structure that Lou called the room. He called the entire site the garden and the room, approached by a broad staircase, 100-foot wide, in the manner of memorials from the past. When you get to the top of the steps, which is the peak point where I had raised the contours, you look down onto a green surrounded by the avenues or the alleys of trees which shade the walks along the promenades on the outer edge of the island.
I've been there twice. It is really stunning.
Yes.
Particularly when you make the transition between the garden and the room.
Yes.
There's a selection in your book about you're going to see the memorial in 2012 when it was finished after 38 years.
Yes. I can read that. Shall I?
Please.
Okay. It is a beautiful fall morning in October 2012. I have emerged out of the Manhattan traffic and skyscrapers inside a crowded cable car that lifts off and carries me in a noiseless flight over the East River to Roosevelt Island. The other passengers are young workers and island residents, as well as some, like me, who will be guests at the opening ceremony for the recently completed Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, now named Four Freedoms Park, designed by Lou with my help. The island comes into view. At its tip, I see the gleaming memorial for the first time. This is after 40 years.
Yeah.
I am dazzled by it and wonder what it will be like after 35 years of waiting for it to become a reality. Lou and I worked together over a period of 13 months on the project, in which he had 15 other works in his office underway. But we'd not quite completed the schematics before Lou's sudden death. But his optimism about the merit of this design, demanding presence, as he said, in the world, allowed me to hope that the last of his great works would be built in my lifetime. Suspended above the river, I'm a time traveler, my mind rippling through the years between March 1974 and this moment. The cable car lands softly, and I disembark, heading with a crowd to the southern tip of Roosevelt Island. I pass the 19th century ruin of the smallpox hospital, which we had hoped to repurpose to provide services for visitors, and enter the precincts of the memorial itself. There are the trees that we had added as placeholders, hoping eventually to reinstate the entire entry grove. And there are the great granite stairs, 100 feet wide, rising before me. I climb them with great anticipation, and although I know what to expect, I am surprised all the same by the green that opens before me, flanked by alleys of low trees. The green is filled now with people celebrating this remarkable achievement, and the ceremony that unfolds is beautifully orchestrated with speeches and clapping. I am thrilled and surprised to be acknowledged before the crowd as Lou's landscape architect on the project. My great longing was to live a life in art, and with Lou's help, I had found a way to do it. The work allowed me to transcend myself and be part of something bigger and more lasting. Later, as the crowd disperses, I make my way down the slope, stepping from the garden into the room, with its vista across to the United Nations and downriver to infinity. I am overwhelmed by what has been achieved. While there are elements that I wish had remained truer to Lou's and my original intent, the room is marvelous. Its scale is both intimate and grand. It is peaceful, yet demands engagement. It stands with timeless solidity, rendering all the rooms in the skyscrapers of Manhattan and Queens across the river somehow insignificant. With its great granite blocks vibrating next to each other 1 inch apart, it is a physical embodiment of Lou's mythic moment, quote, when the walls parted and the column became, unquote. Lou spoke of beginnings and how he loved them above all else. The room, he said, was the beginning of architecture. And so it was. I had come not to the end of something, but to the beginning.
The book is Our Days Are Like Full Years, a memoir with letters from Louis Kahn. Thank you for joining us, Harriet.
Thank you, George. It's been fun to talk with you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin. Tom, close us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 8,000 significant modernist houses, and access 3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino, who we've never seen dance the Macarena, researched guests from her dining room table. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back with another more architecturally romantic, our days are like years, I knew right away I was in love edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.